Jocelyn, and the claim I will be refuting against is that the lack of regulation in meat production leads to negative impacts in society. Now, my opponent's secondary claims are that, first, that the lack of regulations make it very easy for deadly diseases to spread, and it leaves thousands of workers injured, and that the production of meat is harmful to the environment. Now, my response to the first secondary claim is that the lack of inspection that leads to deadly diseases like E. coli to spread is exaggerated. Now, just because there has been cases where people have caught E. coli, it doesn't mean that it was just because of the lack of inspection. There is a good chance that E. coli did not come from the way the meat was packaged. Now, today, the scientifically validated safety practices included in modern beef production, coupled with strict government requirements, allow us to control foodborne pathogens in the beef supply more effectively than ever. Now, the beef industry continues to invest millions of dollars in developing new technologies with the goal of eliminating foodborne illnesses. Now, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, most illnesses from E. coli have been associated with eating uncooked ground beef. Now, there has been approximately 73,000 cases of infection and 61 deaths occurring in the U.S. each year. Now, most of these cases are linked to eating undercooked ground beef, drinking raw milk, and swimming in or drinking sewage-contaminated water. Now, eating meat that is inadequately cooked is the most common way of possible exposure to E. coli. Now, my response to the secondary claim is that the lack of safety regulations could not be the only main cause that could have left someone in the meat production to develop carpal tunnel. For example, illnesses such as diabetes, arthritis, and obesity can cause carpal tunnel to develop. Now, I'm not arguing that the worker couldn't have developed carpal tunnel or can't develop carpal tunnel, but it isn't because of the lack of regulation. Now, the employee is probably aware of he or she could develop due to a lot of hand movements. Now, when taking the job at a packaging plant, the worker knows the risks they are putting themselves into. Now, all jobs lead to injuries, but some are obviously more severe than others. Now, any job that involves movement of the hands will put you at risk of getting carpal tunnel, but of course it's treatable. Now, my last response to the final secondary claim is that the packaging plants are not fully responsible for the emission of greenhouse gases. Now, despite the claims to the contrary, the industry, along with the animal agriculture and meat consumption, contribute only a small part of the U.S. greenhouse gas production. Now, according to the EPA, in 2007, only 2.8% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions came from animal agriculture. Since 1990, animal agriculture's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions has remained nearly constant. Now, this is impressive considering the increase in the meat production of almost 50%. Now, the fact that the greenhouse gas emissions from the U.S. animal agriculture have remained relatively constant while protein production has increased dramatically reflects how little these plants contribute to the emission of greenhouse gases. Now, in conclusion, when saying that the lack of inspection leads to E. coli spreading, it's an exaggeration, and that the lack of safety regulations isn't the only reason that the workers could develop carpal tunnel. And lastly, that the packaging plants are not fully responsible for the emission of greenhouse gases. Thank you.
All right, structurally everything's pretty clear. I think the first point basically talks about E. coli, and you try to diminish the point by pointing out that we don't even know that it's the meat production that is the primary source of this. There are other things that are listed as potential sources. I thought that was pretty good. The number of deaths that are associated with E. coli nobody thinks that 61 deaths is a good thing, but let's put it in perspective. The total number of deaths on a daily basis in the U.S. probably a heck of a lot higher, and that other diseases, especially foodborne pathogens, might be responsible for a greater amount. The connection to the food being undercooked, I think that that's a good point. You might want to point out that there are education programs to convince people not to do that, that it's the preparation of the foods, not the production of the foods, that causes this problem. So in other words, the responsibility is more likely to lie with Jack in the Box, McDonald's, Burger King, In-N-Out, Five Guys, and those folks, rather than their producers that they are getting their meat package from. So, I think that that's a legitimate point to make on that issue. The second point, if the only injury that they talk about is carpal tunnel syndrome, and that is inherent in any job where there is this kind of repetitive physical activity, I'm not sure why it's unique. I think you've got a very good challenge here that it's not a lack of regulation that causes this. There's probably not a dispute that there is carpal tunnel syndrome in people who do this kind of manual labor. But not everybody who does it gets it, as it's indicated by the information that you present. Again, there's no source on this information. I still think it's probably true that there are other things that can contribute to carpal tunnel syndrome. Then I think you've raised some good questions here. And what is inherently distinctive about the meatpacking industry versus any other industry? Because my guess would be if you compared a lot of administrative assistant jobs, for instance, and looked at the frequency of carpal tunnel in those situations, it would be relatively high in comparison to the meatpacking industry. One of the things that's missing, from the argument is a contrast of the positions that you're taking to the evidence that the advocate used. You don't really refer much to the evidence that the advocate's using on these points, and I think that would be another way that you could maybe minimize that point. I thought the greenhouse gas argument was pretty effective. You had some good statistics on that. Once again, I think it's a little problematic that you're not citing a source here. There was one source that you cited on this point, but later on there's an argument that says it stayed consistent despite a 50% increase in production, and I didn't get a source citation on that point. I thought your summary was very effective at explaining what the issues were and how you thought you would address them. All right.